Good morning, Dr. Norton here. We are kicking off our American Lit 2 class with a work by a man named Bret Harte. Now for this lecture I've come down to the Dana Point Harbor. You can see behind me, beautiful day. Apropos because Bret Harte is considered a local color writer. As a local color writer, he is one who sought to recreate, reinterpret the real color, sound, and smells of the culture he was living in, which was California, in the 19th century. So let's get into it. Some biographical information about Bret Harte here. I'm looking at my notes on the left, that's why I keep turning away from you, so forgive me. Francis Bret Harte was born in New York on August 25th, 1836. He is credited with inventing this thing I just called the local color style of American fiction. This style was also taken up by a man you might remember, you might know his name. His name is Mark Twain. Another local color writer was Harriet Beecher Stowe, and there are many others. Bret Harte left school at the age of 13. He learned Greek as a child and was fascinated by the works of Shakespeare, Dickens, Irving, and Fielding. He started writing early. His poems were first published when he was 11 years old. Bret Harte worked in a lawyer's office and the financial office of a businessman. In 1854, at the age of 18, he traveled from New York to California. This was a big trip. The gold rush in the state was over by then, but its effects were still being felt. Bret Harte had several jobs out in California, including teacher, printer, messenger, and journalist on the Northern California newspaper. In addition to writing and working, he campaigned for the rights of Indians and Mexicans in the area, and in fact left the newspaper after protesting about a massacre of Indians in 1860. Now, Bret Harte's feelings for the rights of Indians and the rights of Mexicans in California will play a part in this text, so watch for that. He got married and moved to San Francisco, where he published a text called condensed novels, which were basically parodies of classical writers like Charles Dickens. Harte became the editor of a periodical called The Californian, and at one point he hired Mark Twain as a journalist. In 1868, while he was still working as an editor, he wrote a text, the text we're reading in our class right now, called The Luck of Roaring Camp. This text made him world famous. By 1871, the Atlantic Monthly was paying him a world record fee of $10,000 for 12 stories in 1 year. 10 grand. By today's standards, that'd be quite a bit more money. Financially speaking, this was the high point of his life. He moved back east, but had little further success after this. He moved again and again. He went to Germany, to Scotland, and finally to London, where he died of cancer on May 5th, 1902. Cinco de Mayo. Alright, so The Luck of Roaring Camp. He wrote this text, this story, 10 years after the Civil War. In many ways, what he does in this story, he creates a literary West. And what do I mean by that? Well, the West Coast, California, was really an unknown literary landscape. No one had really written about this place, where I sit today, actually. No one had really written about California to this point. No real substantial writers. In many ways, this was a fulfillment of what Ralph Waldo Emerson, a few years before, had cried out for. We need writers to write about this new America. That was what Emerson said. Emerson was tired of the British and saying, we're done with the British. The British can write about their own country. We need to write about our country. We need a literature of America. And who will rise up and answer this call? And so Bret Harte was really one of those men, one of those artists who created the literary West. The first of Harte's California short stories to achieve great nationwide and worldwide circulation was this one. I just mentioned that already. Again, published in August of 1868 as part of the Overland Monthly publication, of which Harte was the editor. In this text, and in much of what Harte writes, we see a contest between romanticism and realism. Romanticism and realism. We'll get into both those ideas in this lecture. The first part, realism. Where do we see realism at work in Bret Harte? Well, in this idea of the local color movement. This movement lasted from 1865 to 1880, roughly. Local color writing has its roots in frontier humor. It produced its works long after the Civil War. Local color writers had a self-conscious and exclusive interest in rendering a given location a factual, realistic technique. As a writer, Bret Harte was outwardly realistic. He was one of the first to introduce what we might consider low-life characters into serious literary works. This was part of the local color scheme. He has cunning gamblers, gaudy prostitutes, uncouth robbers. Now, he got away with this by showing the complexity of these characters and their unexpected capacity for good. Charles Dickens greatly admired Bret Harte's work. And as you may know, Charles Dickens did much of the same thing. Think of a text like David Copperfield. This is a poor orphan child whom really takes the center stage of Charles Dickens' great work, David Copperfield. This was not a very common technique, though, to use these quote-unquote low-life characters as their heroes. Well, what other kind of things made local writing popular? Local color writing was popular. Well, America wanted to know what the country looked like. The Transcontinental Railroad was being constructed at this time. Really, that happened in 1851, 1850. And so just before this, we have the Transcontinental Railroad, but it was still being expanded. There wasn't a whole lot of transcontinental travel. It wasn't that easy. Obviously, there were no airplanes. And so people weren't really moving around that easily. America was not an easy place to travel around. Not yet, at least. And so Americans were curious, what is going on in other parts of this nation? And so the local color artists really played into this market. How did the varied races live and talk? It was an age of the first maps and surveys of the West. It was an age in which the rails of the first transcontinental railroad had connected the East and the West. I mentioned that. So in some ways, the East was asking what kinds of people are leading what kinds of lives at the ends of those bands of iron. That's one way to say it. The Western regionalists, the Western local color writers answered, men and women like yourselves are out West. They dress differently, they speak differently, and they live in different social ways. Out West we have fantastic deserts, mile-deep canyons, mountains high enough to bear snow all year round. We have forests with trees as wide as a man can reach and wider. Villages where the only woman was the town whore. Camps where the only currency was gold dust. Writers from the South told of swamps where the cypress grew out, the green scummed water, and the moss grew down into it, and of cities where the obsessive blood consciousness of its inhabitants testified to the mingling of races. In the Midwest, authors narrated the tales of the plains where a man could be lost in the dust or ruined by a hailstorm, of cities where fortunes were made or lost in a day's trading on the beef or grain exchanges. This was the Midwest. Some local colors by region. So you had Mark Twain, Bret Harte, that brought in California, Nevada, and Missouri. You had Edward Eggleston in the hills of Indiana. George W. Cable and William Harbin in the Delta County of North Georgia. Mary Knowles Murphy in the mountains of Tennessee. Sarah Orne Jewett, you'll read some of her this week, and Mary E. Wilkins Freeman, the back country of New England. Harold Frederick, the upstate valleys of New York. E.W. Howe, the village life of Kansas. Hamlin Garland, the towns and plains of the Dakotas and Wisconsin. Henry Blake Fuller, the cement cliffs of Chicago. And Henry Harland in the tenements of Manhattan. These are some of the more famous local color writers. Warner Berthoff writes, at its most compelling, American local color realism points toward an imaginative society that is at once objective and visionary. The images it yields up compose the fragments of a book of the people, an essential history of their lives, common conditioning. Paradoxically, at this level of realization, the particular local circumstances begin to appear incidental. The same stories are told in more or less detail on all sides. So all sides of the story are told through local color writing. So in addition to this work being considered a piece of local color writing, it also falls into the literary movement called Romanticism. Let's have a quick review of literary movements and periods, because I think this can get confusing for people at times. So let's go through this. Some of the the major literary movements. We'll start with the medieval period. The medieval period would be considered the years 500 to 1500. This is all AD, right? Or Common Era. After the medieval period, we have the Renaissance period of literature, from 1500 to 1670. After the Renaissance, we have the Enlightenment period of literature, which is 1700 to 1800. The Romantic period comes next, and that's where this text falls, which is 1798 to 1870. After that, the Transcendental movement from 1830 to 1860. Then the Victorian period from 1837 to 1901. The Realism period, 1820 to 1920. A similar time, kind of overlapping with realism, we have Naturalism as a period of literature. Naturalism, which is 1870 to 1920. Those are concurrent. Modernism, it really begins kind of to take effect in 1910. And it really stretches all the way to 1965. Some would argue that we're still in the modern period, but we have a newer period that really is said to have begun in 1965, which is called postmodernism. And postmodernism would say to have begun in 1965, and it is what we're in today, in the postmodern era, the postmodern movement of literature. All right, we'll take a little break.